Hey, welcome to episode 50 of Mini Pod with me, Dave Jacobs. No fluff, just good stuff in under 5 minutes. I think we need to be concerned with declining churches, but not as concerned with plateaued churches, and careful not to read too much into growing churches. In my growing practice, I have a number of clients who pastor churches that are in decline and have been declining for quite some time. I believe this is a cause of genuine concern. It's rare that you find a healthy church that's in decline. The exception to this is when a church has been unhealthy and the people who've contributed to this lack of health leave the church. When this happens, there'll be an initial decline, but once the results of this decline level off and stabilize, assuming that they do, the opportunity for health returns. What is the lesson from this? Number one, if a church has been in decline, it's essential for the pastor to help his or her leaders admit that the church is in trouble. Typically, admitting this will be met with great resistance. Unless the church can admit they are headed in the wrong direction and be willing to embrace significant change, they will, and I say this with very little doubt, dwindle and dwindle until they and oftentimes their pastor will lack viability. My experience has been that a church lacks viability long before they recognize the lack of viability, and by the time they do, it's often too late to turn things around. Number two, if there are people in your church that are contributing to an unhealthy environment, you gotta let them leave, or in some cases invite them to leave. I know that some of these people represent money and volunteers. Their departure will leave holes, but the holes they leave behind will be smaller than the wholeness their presence is preventing. We need to be concerned with declining churches, not as concerned with plateau churches, and careful not to read too much into growing churches. I'm not too concerned with plateaued churches. I know plenty of healthy churches that have plateaued. There can be all kinds of reasons why a church plateaus, most of which have nothing to do with a lack of health. We've been told that all healthy things grow and reproduce, but this is not always true. We've been told that there are growth barriers that need to be broken, and this is a carryover from the old church growth movement, those days that conditioned so many pastors to believe that their church should be expected to grow and grow and grow. Why is it that denominations rush in to help smaller churches that have plateaued, but ignore larger churches that have plateaued? What are the lessons from this? Number one, if your church has plateaued, this may or may not reflect a problem. Don't assume that you have a problem. If you don't, I suggest that you bring in a consultant like myself. Yes, there was some shameless self-promotion, to help you and your leaders objectively analyze the possible reasons and responses to the plateau. Number two, educate your leaders so that they'll understand that just because our church isn't growing doesn't necessarily mean we're doing something wrong. We need to be concerned with declining churches, not as concerned with plateau churches, and careful not to read too much into growing churches. Now, I love to hear that churches are growing, but I try not to read too much into their climbing numbers. Remember, the only thing that numbers on Sunday morning really tell us is how many were there on Sunday morning. Numbers do not automatically tell us the spiritual depth of our people, nor the degree in which they're devoted followers of Jesus. Believe it or not, a church can be growing but still not be healthy. And what's the lesson in this? If your church is growing, rejoice, but don't assume that your numbers represent disciples. A false sense of security can result from growth. Number two, numbers can reflect health. For example, a higher percentage of people serving than the year before, a higher percentage of people sharing their faith and inviting people to church than the year before, a higher percentage of people praying, volunteering, giving, and leading than the year before. These are the type of rising numbers that indicate health. So we need to be concerned with declining churches, not as concerned with plateau churches, and careful not to read too much into growing churches. That's it for now. This is Dave Jacobs of Small Church Pastor. Have a great week.